It's a interesting story. It started out actually when I was a little boy. 1973, like a lot of American boys playing American football, and I say that because I love English football also. But I had problems with my legs. They hurt all the time, and I started running slower and slower, no matter how hard I tried to, strengthen them. So finally, my mother took me to the doctors, and they did X-rays, and they discovered that I had the beginnings of a bone marrow disease in my legs, and it was becoming very weak, and that's why my legs hurt, and I couldn't run. So at the time, my mother's mother, my Italian grandmother, had a great devotion to Padre Pio. So I went to see her one Sunday and asked her to pray for me, to Padre Pio, to heal my legs. Believe it or not, during the same week, one of my aunts in the town that Joey Lamangino lived in Lindenhurst, New York, was having Joey over her house to do a talk about Garabandal. So my mother's sister invited us to come over, and I had heard that Joey Lamangino had a large medal about 2 inches high that the Blessed Mother kissed, and that some people were gaining miracles from venerating this medal. So we listened to Joey talk, and after the talk, I went up, I kissed the medal, and I really didn't think anything of it. I was about 13 years old, so I didn't really realize what was going on. 2 weeks later, my legs started to feel a lot better, and I went back to the doctor, and they took X-rays again, and my legs were completely healed.
Gosh.
And the doctors were actually upset because they thought my mother was trying to play some kind of joke on them, and she was thrilled, and they just couldn't understand what happened. But we knew something happened, either between Padre Pio or the Blessed Mother. But now the funny thing is, 20 years goes by. That was 1973. 1993, a friend of mine, I lived in that town, Lindenhurst, at the time, and he says, I want to go listen to this guy talk about a Marian apparition. And I was like, oh, all right, I'll go along. I really didn't want to, but I went, out of our friendship. And when I walked in the door, I didn't know it at the time, it was Joey Lamangino's house. And I see Joey, and instantly I'm shocked because he's got a face you can't forget from the accident that he had, and the scar on his forehead. And I was like, Peter, I know this guy. He goes, how could you know him? I said, I met him like 20 years ago. I got a healing from this medal. So we listened to Joey talk, and of course, I went up afterwards and started talking to him. And since I lived in the town and I mostly worked late afternoons and nights, I said, I'd love to come down here in the Garabandal Center and volunteer in the daytime. So I started, for about a year and a half or so, was there, constantly in the daytime, doing anything they needed, sending out leaflets or booklets, making rosaries, whatever they needed. And Joey and I became very close in that first 2-year period because we saw each other every day. And, we were going to lunch together and working together, and it was just wonderful. And after about 2 years, I started to felt confident that I knew enough about Garabandal, or I started doing talks about it, going to either churches or private homes and things like that. And, Joey said, Glenn, you're not exactly shy. He says, I want to offer you to be our public relations director. So I thought it was a tremendous honor. And I said, well, I'm really not worthy of it, but, I'll do anything you want me to do. So after doing the normal things that I was doing, I started to, I had this thought, I'm sure it was implanted by Mary in my head, to try to get Joey's story on TV. So I started writing all the major networks in America, and I was turned down by everybody. And finally, in 1995, I again, the Blessed Mother gave me the thought, try EWTN, Mother Angelica. And so I wrote and called the president, Bill Steltemeyer, every week for 6 months straight. And finally, he called up Joey and said, please stop this guy from calling me. You can come on Mother Angelica's live show one time. but tell him to please leave me alone, you know. So, you know, we flew down to Alabama, and we had dinner with Mother Angelica, and we shot the show that night, and it wound up being the highest rated show they ever had. And, you know, that was the beginning of him appearing several times on Mother Angelica. And that really helped to expand the knowledge of Garabandal throughout the United States. And then finally, in around 2009, I had the idea, being on Facebook, I said, you know, Joey, how about I start a Garabandal page to help promote the video? Joey had made the video. And I said, you know, I can reach more people on Facebook in a day than we can reach in a year with mailings and everything else, conferences. So I started the page, and by the end of the first year, I think I had 100 people, and I was thrilled because, you know, there really wasn't any pages that were interactive. You know, there's informational pages about Garabandal, but no one has a live interactive page where you can ask questions and get answered by somebody who not only works with Joey, but, you know, by that time I had a friendship with Conchita. So I had access to her, which was, you know, such a rare blessing. And it just blew up from there. You know, each year it would grow 100 or a couple of hundred, and then all of a sudden it just exploded. And that's kind of where we are today. There's on the English page is a little over 51,000 people right now, but I hope that's going to get a lot bigger.
So really, it's a full-time job.
It has been. I retired last year. Now I know why God wanted me to retire, because basically I have to monitor the page about 16 hours a day, off and on.
I think the Blessed Mother knew what she was doing way back when she gave you this ministry. But it really has unfolded. And like I say, the page is very, very informative, and gives you a lot of information about what happened. So perhaps we can start there. Share a little about the brief history of Garabandal and the main messages.
Well, it really, again, starts with Joey. Joey, at the age of about 16, is working on his family's ice truck, a delivery truck. And he's got a flat tire on the truck. So he pulls the truck into a gas station, and takes the wheel off, and he's filling up the wheel, and the tire explodes, and the rim hits him in the forehead, severing his olfactory nerves, causing him to go blind and lose his sense of smell. And he goes into a coma. And the interesting thing is, this was on June 27th in 1947. That was the feast of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And it's funny how everything in Joey's life falls on some type of Marian day. July 16th of that year, he finally wakes up out of the coma. And that's on the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Interesting, because that's who appeared in Garabandal. So Joey, through the graciousness of a benefactor, is sent to a blind school to learn how to educate himself. And later on, he goes into the family business. And in 1961, he's very tired, and one of his uncles decides, why don't we take a vacation? Let's go to Italy. So while they're in Italy, his uncle was devoted to a Padre Pio, who was alive, obviously, at the time, and said, let's go see him, and maybe we can go to confession. And so they wait online like everybody else for hours, and Joey goes into confession, and he gives his general confession. And Padre Pio tells him, "Is that all, Joey?" And he's like, "Yeah, basically that's it." And he goes on to telling Joey literally everything that he didn't confess. And he's very specific, to the point where, Joey breaks down and is quite, sorrowful and sorry for everything that happened. And it changes his life. That confession changes his life. And Padre Pio tells him, "Have a little courage, Joey. You're going to be okay. Have courage." So about 2 years later, 1963, he decides to go back to see Padre Pio again. And, Padre Pio obviously knows who he is at this point. And in a separate room, he touches Joey's nose and forehead with his hand, and Joey jumps back because for the first time since he's 16, he smells roses. So by touching his forehead, Padre Pio restored his sense of smell, which was physically impossible because his nerves are like wires. They were cut. It's impossible for those senses to reappear. So when he received this miracle, he had complete faith in everything Padre Pio said to him, obviously, as anyone would. And he said, I understand that there is these apparitions in Garabandal ongoing. Is it true? And Padre Pio says, yes, it is true. He goes, should I go? He goes, yes, what, sure, why not? And Padre Pio then, with his uncle, I'm sorry, Joey with his uncle, with his Padre Pio's blessing, goes to Garabandal, meets Conchita, and that's how the whole thing starts. Mm-hmm. Now, Joey comes back to America, and he forms a Braille photo album. His uncle had taken pictures of all the events going on. He put them in a photo album and put a Braille caption underneath the pictures. And literally, Joey starts going door to door with people he knows first, and then anyone who will accept them later on, mm-hmm. and telling the Garabandal story. And then he starts to use his house as the Garabandal Center. And he starts out simply with just printing leaflets and handing out leaflets, and then slowly doing, talks, and that emerges into conferences. And that's how it all kind of started. It's amazing how one blind man with the faith of God and a little courage could accomplish so much.
So Joey was really instrumental in all of this.
The most important person, I think, for the worldwide knowledge of Garabandal. I don't think anybody's ever done any more than he did.
So the messages again, I know from looking at the messages myself, one of the things that Our Lady was saying was that the cup is overflowing. And I think we can see these events happening in real time in front of our eyes with this global pandemic, again, what's going on in the US with the election. Perhaps you can share what your insights are and what your feeling is about the messages unfolding right now in the world.
It's pretty simple and obvious to see the world is changing and not in a good way. And one of the crystal clear things for me is there was a mention of 3 events that would happen before the Garabandal warning. And Mary spoke of the return of communism. And this confused a lot of people. Imagine this is 1960s. She's saying this, and they're saying the return of communism. Where's it going? How could it possibly leave? So no one understood what was going to happen in, I think it was 1991 when, they disbanded the Soviet Union. Yeah. So that was the first confusing thing. But now over time, you see that obviously Mary was right. It was there. It did go away for a time, and it's back in force. And you can see communism flexing its muscles, not only here in America, but especially in China, where, they're closing down churches and other things. So that was one prophecy, was the return of communism. The second prophecy was a synod would happen, a church synod. Now, we just had a synod in 2019, and of course that upset a lot of people because of the wooden idols that we used at the Vatican. So that kind of made that synod stand out from almost any other one that I can think of. Now, there's also another one in 2022, but for some reason, I have a feeling that might be the one that she was indicating because it was so controversial. And the last sign before the warning is Mary said that the Pope would return from a trip to Moscow, specifically Moscow. And when he returned to the Vatican, hostilities were going to break out in Europe. And then not too long after that, the warning would come. So we're pretty close. You have your synod and you have communism.
So it's quite remarkable to see what's happening right now. So just going back to, again, Garabandal, the story of it, and the 4 children that were involved. Mm-hmm. share a little bit about, obviously, what happened then. The obviously lots went on, supernatural events went on, levitations, the Eucharist, etc. Perhaps you can share some of the miracles that took place there.
Sure. Tremendous amount of supernatural events, pretty much on a daily basis. Probably the first thing that was important was the girls. Again, these are 11 and 12-year-old girls, and they had the mentality of kind of an 8-year-old when doctors tested them. So in the beginning, this area of Garabandal is very rocky. They would ask the Blessed Mother to kiss stones. And she said, I'll do it this one time, but I would prefer you brought me sacramentals. So when people started to believe that Mary was appearing, the girls would say, bring sacramentals. We don't want her kissing rocks. And so they started to bring rosaries and scapulas and wedding rings, and they would be piled up on a table. So many people started bringing so many things. There'd be a mound of these on a table, and the girls would be able to physically lift them up, have Mary kiss them. Mm-hmm. And again, this is not looking down or looking at a specific person. And they would be able to return the ring or the rosary or the scapula or the missal to the person it belonged to, never looking at them. So this was a miraculous event that was proven time and time again. That's irrefutable. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting stories is one woman actually left a cosmetic compact on a table, and the girls weren't going to submit it. And the Blessed Mother told them, I'll kiss that. And they said, why would you kiss this object of vanity, really? And she later explained to them, it served as a pyx during the Spanish Civil War. So she said, it contained my son. So even that was a miraculous event, that she knew that this was not just a compact, it was actually a pyx. Mm-hmm. One of the most famous things was she would kiss, Bibles and prayer missals. And later on, those, once they were authenticated, they were cut up into little tiny pieces. And I actually have one here that I can show you, and put into little tiny metals. So inside this metal is, if you can see that, there's a very tiny little piece of paper. And that was actually kissed by the Blessed Mother. Some of the other miraculous events were, the girls would always start out these ecstatic walks with the rosary. So it troubles me and bothers me when people say they question Garabandal's authenticity or call it demonic. I said, name another apparition that started out with the rosary every day. But they would take these walks for long periods of time through rocky cow paths, uphill, always looking up. Try looking at the sky for a half an hour and walk around. It's impossible. Yes. How they didn't fall, how they didn't get injured, how they didn't break their ankles is amazing. One of the most important things was these ecstatic flights at night. So now it's nighttime, the dangerous ground that they're walking on. And one of the things the detractors of Garabandal say is, this is a sign of demonic possession, walking backwards. And unfortunately, people don't take the time to learn about Garabandal because there's so much information. Nobody really investigates everything, like I have. And those flights backwards were when they exited the church. So they didn't want to walk away from the tabernacle, turning their back on Jesus, so to speak. So they would walk backwards. And again, it's just another sign of a miraculous event that they could even do this walking forward, but even walking backwards up a rocky hill without getting injured. Other events were two grown men. Once the girls were in an ecstatic state, two grown men couldn't pick a girl off the ground. They were almost like bolted to the ground. And yet the girls could lift each other to kiss the Blessed Mother. Doctors tested them. They started out by pinching the girls when they were in an ecstatic state, and there was no reaction. And then they went to poking them with needles. And then when that didn't work, they actually burned them with matches, tried to burn them with matches. That didn't work. Then they tried throwing sand in their eyes to make them blink, and that didn't work. And then they would take flash camera bulbs and flash the bulbs in their eyes to get them to blink, and that couldn't make them blink. And then one of the biggest confirmations that this was a valid apparition was called the Little Miracle, where it was announced 2 weeks in advance that the Blessed Mother told them that they were going to have, Conchita was going to receive the Eucharist on her tongue. So the night that this happens, there's countless amount of people. There's 2 cameras, and there's a rolling a film camera filming her tongue. So she sticks out her tongue. There's nothing on it. You can see it. And then all of a sudden, an illuminated Eucharist appears on her tongue. So here's a miracle announced in advance, witnessed by countless people on film, on a rolling camera, and still pictures. It's irrefutable.
Totally irrefutable. I mean,
yeah,
they were really footage. You just have, it is absolutely remarkable.
Yeah.
So the church came out in the 60s, am I right, to do an investigation on the happenings, and their findings, according to them, they didn't agree it was a supernatural event. Is that right?
Well, it wasn't the church. It was the local bishop. So I really would like to clarify this, because it's one of the stumbling blocks for a lot of people. And it's a very long story, unfortunately, but there was apparitions in Spain, in Azteca, in the 30s, where the similar thing happened. And it was during a fight of like a Spanish Civil War. And almost the country was divided on people who believed this apparition and those that didn't. And it became where the government had to step in and say, enough is enough. I don't want to hear any more about this apparition. So now fast forward another 30 years, and Garabandal happens, and the local bishop says, oh, here we go, another apparition. And he tried to squash this from the very beginning. And the most interesting thing is he appoints a priest to start the investigation. This priest is so convinced by the time he's done, he quits the commission. Now they appoint laity. They bring in doctors and social workers to do the investigation. How do you do an investigation where you don't interview the girls at all? They never interviewed the girls, never interviewed their parents, never wrote down anything from anyone who attested to the daily miracles. They only took stories from people who didn't believe. So after a while, they basically just gave up, because they didn't have enough information to send to the Vatican to say this wasn't a true apparition. They couldn't prove it wasn't a true apparition. So all they did was declare it non-constat. So, I mean, there's a specific term, non-constat, and there's 3 different terms. But non-constat supernaturalitate says we're not sure if it's supernatural or not. So this way, the bishop didn't say it's true, it's definitely not true. He said, we're not sure. And then later on, and this is what's, again, another miraculous event, that priest that I told you about who investigated and resigned from the commission, he later becomes a bishop in the 80s. And he starts a new investigation in 1987. And he has all the documentation, all of the eyewitness stories, that all got sent to the Vatican. So the Vatican actually has a physical report in favor of this. But just so your audience knows, back in 1968, Pope Paul VI actually requested Conchita to come, and he wanted to hear it for himself. And when she left, he was convinced of the apparition was true. She gave him the date of the future miracle. And he said, Conchita, I bless you, and the whole church blesses you.
Obviously, we don't know that date.
No, just Just Conchita and the Pope, no.
Okay, so the girls, Conchita, I know, is still with us. She's still alive, and you have contact with her. How about the other girls? And how has Conchita's life? We know that she lives a very private life. She doesn't like living in the spotlight, because I remember many years ago, she was on RTE. I don't know if you remember this or know about it. She was on RTE, the Irish chat show.
Yes.
She was quite shy. She was, coming forward about the whole thing. And so is her life now, what is it like?
I'll talk about all four girls for you quickly. Yeah. And we'll end with Conchita. So Mary Lily, unfortunately, passed away in 2009. She had suffered from lupus and died from a lung disease. She was only 59. She lived in New Hampshire, had 3 children. Jacinta moved to California, married, has a daughter. I still have contact with her family. And Mary Cruz remained in Spain, but moved about 100 miles from Garabandal in Avia, Spain. And occasionally she's seen in Garabandal, but not frequently. It's interesting that 3 of the 4 girls moved to America, of all places. But Conchita moved to New York. A doctor brought her over and trained her in his medical practice, and that's how she actually started out, as like a nurse's aide with this doctor, and wound up staying in New York. She's a widow now. Her husband passed away in 2013 of cancer. She has 4 children. But you're right. She leads a very quiet, humble, spiritual life. I don't think her neighbors even know who she is, because she's moved several times. And you would never know it if you bumped into her on the street, who she was right there in her parish and her town. Very few people know who she is, and she wants to keep it that way. She has a mission in life, and her mission was she is a visionary. She also is to be a wife, a mother, and she has to give the notice of the miracle 8 days in advance. And that's really her last mission. A lot of people ask me, why doesn't she come on TV? Why doesn't she speak now? Well, she basically did that for 20 years. She gave interviews. She wrote a book. She appeared on TV. She says, I've answered every question so many times. It's all there in the books. She keeps saying everything. You keep asking me the same questions. So there really is no purpose for her to constantly be on answering the same questions. And I can relieve some of that pressure from her by having the Facebook page, because I answer the same questions a million times, and that's my job, so to speak. So it doesn't bother me.
Obviously, when you look at the footage of them as children and the crowds that attended the apparitions and the sight, for children, it must have been extremely overwhelming for them to have this world all of a sudden look at them. And I can imagine that was very challenging for them at the time.
Conchita, remarked about this quite a bit when she left. She said it physically became impossible for her to go outside.
Yeah.
Every day, it's not only the townspeople and the surrounding towns that came, but people came from overseas. Everybody wants to see her. Everybody wants to touch her. Everybody wants her to pray for her. Everybody, it became so ridiculous that she couldn't go outside. She couldn't do her daily chores. And then people started telling her what to do. You have to pray this way. You have to do this. You should become a nun. And even to the point where she later on entered a convent, and Jesus actually appeared to her in a locution and said, I didn't tell you to come here. I don't want you here. I want you out in the secular world. So she actually left. So it became just a matter of, having a life and fulfilling her duties and her vocation, which was to be in the world and give this 8-day notice. I don't know if you remember, but she's been fairly quiet since the 80s. And, our friendship has evolved over the years. I'm still amazed, quite honestly, because I feel like we're almost like the odd couple. She's so humble and holy, and then there's me. and she, I rarely ask her for anything public. And last year, when this pandemic started, and there was so much confusion and so much worry, I sent her an email actually, and I said, listen, you can see what's going on. People are very concerned about the world, and think about maybe just releasing a little sentence to, maybe help people out. And she did release a paragraph. I released it on my site, and then it spread from there. I don't know if you saw that message, but I'd like to read it. So this way, anyone who hasn't heard it will hear it. So I'm just going to read from it so it's correct.
Yes, thank you.
God is detaching us from the securities of this world. In the silence of the church or in our house, we are now able to make an examination of conscience so we can clean what prevents us from hearing the voice of God clearly. With sincerity, we can ask God to tell us what he wants of us today, and continue to do that every day, and spend as much time as possible with God at church or somewhere in your home or somewhere where you find the silence. He is all we need. And this was said on March 19th in 2020.
Incredible. So really, I guess the message of Garabandal is we really need to offer as much sacrifices as we can. Pray the rosary. We can't really attend the Blessed Sacrament right now. But what would be your advice to us, Glenn, and for those who have a huge Marian devotion? What will we do in order to avoid these catastrophic possible events happening? Can we do something to make these things not take place in our world?
Well, the interesting thing about Garabandal is it was built on the foundation of the Rosary. Yeah. When Saint Michael first appeared to the girls, one of the very first things he did was actually teach them the Rosary. They hadn't known the Rosary. And this was the first miracle, really, because the parents didn't teach them the Rosary. And yet the girls are reciting the Rosary, and they're like, how do you know that? Mm-hmm. So once he taught them the Rosary, every apparition started with Mary with a Rosary. So that message of the Rosary was very strong visually to the onlookers, and it became a message in that town to the point where I heard the story confirmed many times that there's a nightly rosary in Garabandal for the past 500 years. And maybe that's why that town was selected. And the Blessed Mother actually said, God considered this place sacred. And maybe that's why she appeared there so much. But the foundation of the rosary is the beginning of Garabandal. It's one of the main messages of Garabandal. And I think that Marian message is for all of us. For it's the only hope that we have, really, is prayer. When everything else fails, when your government fails you and your leaders fail you, there's always God listening. And one of the greatest weapons we have, Mary has always talked about using the rosary for whatever we need and whatever we wish, for those who devoutly say it.
So, Glenn, why is the Garabandal shrine different from any other Marian shrine throughout the world?
Well, one of the unusual things is the length of time. Mary appeared for 4 years to Conchita, especially. And during those 4 years, she was adamant about getting across that 3 events are in our future. 2 are guaranteed, 1 is conditional. The first one is the warning. And the warning basically is going to start with almost an explosion in the sky. Conchita described it as 2 stars that collide. There's an explosion of light, but nothing falls. And it's important that I say that, because everybody's trying to predict that 2 actual stars are going to crash and there's going to be damage. But she said nothing falls. So it could be anything that God wants it to be, but this explosion of light, and all time will be suspended. Everything on earth will stop. And at that moment, God is going to let you see your soul as he sees it. He's going to let you see your sins as he sees it. He's going to let you see sins of omission, things that you could have done and didn't do. And this is going to be terrifying to everybody because, most of us think, hey, I'm a pretty good person, and I go to confession. I've got nothing to worry about. I think we're all in for a shock. So that's going to be a great wake-up call to the entire world to see your soul as God sees it and the gravity of sin, because we have no idea how God sees the gravity of each sin. The second thing is the miracle. So the warning will happen, and then the girl said within a year. I think it's going to be a much shorter period of time. My research tells me that the miracle is going to be in the month of April. So I think that it's only logical that the warning should be within a few months of that, prior to it. And the miracle is going to be a 2-stage event. There's going to be something that happens in the sky, and it's going to last about 15 minutes. And then there's going to be a permanent sign left at Garabandal in the sky forever. And it's going to be so miraculous that science cannot disprove it, that it's not from God. Now, the last thing she talked about was the conditional chastisement. And I say conditional because you and I have been talking about the power of the rosary and prayer and bringing back, prayer into people's life, how important it is. Mary said that this chastisement or punishment is based on humanity's response to the warning and the miracle. So if there is repentance and there is conversion and the world does change, we can avert that chastisement. That's why she said it is conditional. My fear is people after the miracle are be like a New Year's Day resolution where they make this great promise and then they don't keep it for very long. Yeah. Afraid people are going to fall back into their old ways over time. But that chastisement was spoken about briefly, but the description that Conchita gave and Mary Lowly gave were pretty horrendous. Conchita said it would be worse than being enveloped by fire from above and below. And Mary Lowly said all she saw in this vision was rivers of blood and fire raining down from the sky. So this is a pretty horrific prediction. And the girls had a vision of this one night. It was called the Night of Screams. And the looks on the girls' faces alone, without even saying a word, so horrified the town that the entire town went to confession the next day.
Okay.
So that's what makes Garabandal unique, is those 3 messages.
And some of the series have called it the illumination of conscience, because there's quite a few books written about it as well.
Yes, the warning. That's the referral to the warning. Yes.
Yeah. So I think we all need to repent and get to confession as much as we possibly can.
I'm there every week, whether I have a standing reservation.
It's been wonderful talking to you today. I mean, I've been following the Garabandal movement for such a long time. And to speak to yourself has been fantastic, very informing, and I'm sure our audience will agree. Again, we put the videos on our website for those who want to see them, and obviously this interview. I just want to thank you personally, Glenn, because the whole Garabandal has needed to be shown all over the world. And I want to thank you for that, because it's powerful. As you say, it is irrefutable what has gone on there. And I pray for your ministry. I just hope that it grows, continues. The message of Garabandal continues to grow. And again, thank you so much for doing this for us. We really appreciate it.
Carol, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me today.
You're very welcome. And God bless.
God bless you too, and your viewers. Thank you.